Hello friends, and welcome back to Learning from Experience video series. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to reflect on the experience. Quick agenda for today. So I'm going to cover our goal. We'll do a quick review of the experiential learning process. And then most of it, as usual, we'll spend doing a hands-on demo. The goal is pretty simple. I'm just going to show you how to make sense and structure the experience using a practical example of penetration testing. From the previous video, we saw that the experiential learning process, we had this learning step. It broke down into capturing the experience, reflecting on the experience, and documenting lessons learned. And in this video specifically, we'll cover these two steps, which is reflection and documentation. So let's hop right to it. So the very first thing that we will start with is creating a knowledge base. So knowledge base, again, it's that like cubbyhole that, I'm going to use to store all my knowledge as we go through extracting it from the experience. And in this case, I'm just going to use a simple Google Drive folder. You can see I have one kind of preset as we're going to fill it in with things that we have learned. So far, it's just a simple folder. I call it KB demo. I have a folder for experiences. All of it is empty right now. I have a temporary folder. It's kind of like my working folder. And last but not least, I have like a README file, just a standard purpose, and we'll add to it as needed. As you will see with most of this, this will be a learning kind of a document and a learning knowledge base. So we'll continue to add and expand and change things in it as different needs arise, right? So without further ado, let's kind of get right to it, right? And in this one, we will use Draw.io, which is a free app you can use to model things out. And I like to start by getting rid of all the lines. We will save this as, let's say, Hack the Box Vaccine Experience. And I'll just navigate to my demo folder here. Here's our temp folder. Right, so now it's saved and we're ready to go. Very first thing, you can use any sort of modeling notation. I like to use BPMN or business process modeling notation. I typically don't follow it very strictly. Ultimately, as any modeler will tell you, use whatever notation you like as long as it makes sense to you. The only complexity is if you have multiple people working on this, just make sure that everybody understands what the modeling standard is, right? And we will start our experience. So I like to start off with just a quick start step. Kind of we started here, right? And now we can use our cherry tree where we captured all of our experiences in the previous video, right? And start kind of using that to help us like remember what was going on. So for example, we ran Nmap, right? So we can start adding different steps. So for example, like run Nmap. At this point, we're not creating like a process diagram necessarily, even though it looks like it, and it in essence is. The main goal is just to kind of help us map out the overall like experience as we went through it. And that's why we're gonna use cherry tree and combine it and kind of expand on it a little bit in this diagram, right? So we had our run Nmap. And what I usually like to do too is to have like little notes that I can leave for myself. And that just helps me to kind of orient myself and jot down any additional points I need to make. So once we got that, we look in our cherry tree. Oh yeah, we had 3 ports that were identified, right? We can use something like this. This will be good enough for now. Symbolize that we have multiple outcomes. It's almost like a fork in the road, if you will. And we'll put identified ports, so 21, 22, and 80, right? So we start to kind of like map it out. What happened after that? Well, we can remember that we went back to like FTP, starting up at the top, right? And we said, well, we can potentially log in as anonymous. Okay, so maybe we want to put a gateway. And they're like a decision-making point. This is a XOR gateway. It's like or, so you can either go one way or the other way. And we start kind of, again, mapping it out a little bit. In this case, maybe we'll say the decision was, can I log in as anonymous? And essentially we have like a yes. Or no, right? Output of this. You don't have to clean it up initially. I am kind of a stickler personally, just to make it look nice. But initially, we just want to go through it and make it, generally ballpark-ish. Again, when we're mapping the experience, it doesn't have to be perfect. And the amount of information we choose to include is just whatever comes to mind. We just want to refine it down a little bit further than just like our notes and kind of organize, well, what was the sequence of events? How did we go through it, right? In our case, we logged in as anonymous and the answer was yes, right? So we started going down that path. Now the question right away becomes, well, what happens if the answer is no? Well, we didn't have that experience. We actually don't know. And so for that, instead of trying to sit here and like rattle our brains, well, what would I do if the answer was no? I just simply leave it as that. And I mark it as a red box just to denote that something might, happen there, but I don't know. I didn't have an experience. And most importantly, I don't have to waste time thinking it through. I just continue modeling through. And at some point later in time, if I ever run into that scenario, then I can come through and like think through that, section of it, right? In this case, what did we do? Well, let's take a look. We went through and then we looked at what files were located in a FTP. So maybe like view directory, right? And now we can also leave ourselves little hints. So in this case, command. And hopefully it starts to kind of make sense. It was ls command that we used to see what files were available. At that point, we might have ran into another decision-making point, like, hey, were there any files or not? So maybe we want to ask ourselves, files exist, right? In our case, the files did exist. And what did we do with it? Well, we downloaded, I remember that backup.zip. Okay, so the file did exist, downloaded files. It's kind of like another, yes or no decision-making point. Again, the question is, well, what if there were no files in it? I don't know, but I don't have to worry about that right now because that would be a waste of my time and that wasn't part of the experience anyway, right? So we're just mapping the experience and we don't have to overthink it. Key thing here is usually not to overthink things, which tends to be a very much something I like to do, get into the weeds of it right away, but we want to avoid that. So we downloaded some files. How did we download the files? Well, we can take a look and we know that there was somewhere in here, the get command, right? So we can, again, start leaving ourselves little notes. And this will come in handy later on, and you'll see kind of like how that works. Because once we map out the experience overall, we're going to kind of like make sense out of it a little bit, organize it, and then we're going to pull out individual like tasks that were completed within that. So we downloaded that backup.zip, then we try to unzip it, right? So let's say unzip file. Now we could put another decision-making point there and say, are files zipped or not? Again, we just want to keep it as simple as possible. For now, I'll just kind of leave it at that. It's unzip the file. That's what I did. And the little command we used was unzip, right? So as you can kind of see, we start to map out our process like a little bit at a time, using our notes, kind of being like, oh yeah, that's good enough for now. We'll come back to it later, etc., etc. Unzip files. Then we actually did run into something, right? So our file was password protected. So maybe we do want to add that gateway to it as a decision-making point, like files protected, yes or no. Again, in our case, the file was protected. So we took a different action. But here's a question: what if the file wasn't protected? Well, at that point, I don't have to do much thinking. I would just, review documentation, right? Review files. Kind of like the reason why we went through Jack the Ripper was because the file was protected, so we had to crack it first. And then we like peeked into it a little bit, right? And we can see it here in our previous notes where we went through, there was a password, then we said, oh, okay, well, we need to run the zip to John command to convert it into that hash file. Then we ran, a rocky.txt word list against the hash, and we finally found our password for that zip file. So let's do that. So convert that zip to that hash, right? That's what we did. And in our case, we did, the command was like, get it. Zip to John. I think it was, that's why it's nice to have those notes, those backup. So it was a file name .zip, and it was converted to file name. And I just put the in between carets, even though the caret is an operation, just to signify as a note that this is something I would insert later on, right? And again, you'll kind of see it as we move through this, how that works out. But then what happened? So we got our hash, and then we ran, oh yeah, John word list file. Okay. So we might say run Ripper. The command that we used. Is something like that, right? And we can, insert the commands in there however we like, ultimately. And expand it. I'm not making this too, like, pretty, although like I said, I'm kind of a stickler. I do go through it and align everything and make it easier on the eye. But as we're kind of going through this for sake of time, we're just going to move through it. So we ran John the Ripper. Was the password cracked? Okay, well, it's either yes or no. So in our case, it was cracked, right? So if it was not cracked, what would I do? I don't know because I didn't get to that point. So again, it's just a knowledge gap. We're going to mark it as that and then move on with our experience. And then if the password was cracked, maybe like, let's say download it, or now it's kind of, we're getting to that point where it's very similar to this step here, right? So what would we do if the password was cracked? Well, review the files that are inside the zip, right? So now instead of having this here, we can actually get rid of this, take this, put it over here, and effectively just connect this to here. So in the event that the files are not password protected over here, it would just expedite us and we would skip straight to review files. If they are password protected, then we have a couple of extra steps to crack the password, right? And then again, you can move around these things. That's why draw IO is kind of cool, just to make it easier on the eye. All right, so we reviewed the content, and then, what are we looking for? That's another one. So we might look for something like hints, look for passwords, usernames, hashes, right? That's actually what we did. If we look back in our experience here, back up that zip, right? We saw that there was an admin password or a username. There was a hash that we found, and it was an MD5 hash. Nice thing about this, when we review files, in our experience, we look for passwords and username. That's something that we've learned. As we experience other things and execute this like password cracking again over and over again, we can expand this like hint section, and it becomes like a checklist, like what to look for in the files that you happen to get. If it's an HTML file, look for these things. If it's a PHP file, look for those things. And you can get a very specific tailored checklist that just continues to expand. So it's like things that you just look for automatically, right? So at this point, we might ask ourselves a simple question. Like, was useful info found? Yes or no? Again, if we don't know, we're just going to add that here. In our case, we ran into a hash password, right? So in our case, if we found the password, we can say, yeah, you know, we did find a hash, but it wasn't a password. So what did we do? Well, we messed around with Jack the Ripper a little bit more, right? To kind of crack the password. And we can see it here. We saved the p.text, and then we ran Rocky word list with the appropriate MD5. So maybe in this case, we would do something like this, like save as a hash text file. We identify type of a hash, right? And I am cheating a little bit. I already have this kind of like experience pre-modeled out just because it would be way too long for me to like try to cram it into like a 30-minute video or so. If we were doing it live, you know, it might take like an hour or something like that. But again, we can identify type of a hash. In our case, it was very simple. And then we're going to like run John the Ripper. John the Ripper, right? What did we do after that? Well, here's the command for it. And did we crack the password? Yeah, we did, you know, password not hash, but cracked. In our case, it was yes, right? But maybe it was going to be a no. So if it's a no, we're just going to put that here as a placeholder. If it's a yes, what do we do? Well, we document findings. And that was really the exploration of our part of the experience that was FTP that we kind of explored a little bit, messed around with it, right? We don't have to do anything other than that. And we didn't in our experience. So remember, we're kind of mapping out the experience, not documenting a process here, and it's very important. But before you know it, our experience starts to look a lot more structured. We have like these steps, right? And we can kind of mess around and play around with them. But very important to highlight, what are we doing while we're creating this model? We're reflecting on our experience. We're recollecting, we're thinking about it. We're saying, okay, how much detail should I include? Oh, did I do this? Well, what if this would happen? So it starts to conceptualize that, and we're going through it systematically, which helps us to kind of like organize and start making sense out of that experience a little bit better, right? We can do the same thing, and I'll just do it for the expediency of it. Because before we get too crazy, after we documented the findings, we were like back over here, right? In our experience, we said, oh, okay, we got our username, password. Okay, well, you know, I remember in Nmap, we had this port 80 open and we did some burp suite, and we actually have it documented here. We looked through like a search bar, et cetera, right? So that point, kind of like going back to the start, was over here, right? So we might have an offshoot of that. Let's put it down here. And we'll call this. That was our action for port 21. And then for port 80, we'll label it real quick. So here's our sequence of steps for port 80. And we're not going to do anything crazy here. It's going to be more of the same. We just kind of go through it step by step and model this whole thing out, right? I'm going to cheat a little bit just for the sake of time, not to make this too long. But we effectively did something that looks like this, right? And just to kind of go through it. So we ran our burp suite, which we got to this screen here, as you recall, hopefully. If not, we got the notes. what they're there for. We used the built-in proxy tab, navigated to the website. We reviewed the website, right? We kind of poked around it a little bit. Some of the hints, again, this is that checklist that we build out. Like, what do we look at when we look at a website? In this case, we looked at a search bar. We looked at URL parameter input, and that was it. And in future experiences, we might look and recognize other things in there as well. Do we find anything useful? If the answer was no, then I don't know what to do after that. But in this case, we did find something useful. We found the search parameter. We looked to see if it was vulnerable or not with SQL map. We kind of went through, seeing if we can get a reverse shell in there. We set up a listening port that 443. So in our experience, that was kind of like over here where we set up our listener. We then ran that bash command through it, which was this one, right? On our shell. That was the command before that. We got the shell from the injection attack, and that connected back to our listener, and we established a reverse shell. Was the reverse shell successful? If yes, we reviewed the system, which is what we did, right? We went to the root directory of the web server. We got the index PHP, or I'm sorry, dashboard PHP. If our reverse shell was not successful, I don't know. We didn't run into that scenario, so just mark it as question mark, right? And we just continue on until we found a different password in dashboard.php. Just kind of add a couple of different things. And we documented the findings, right? And in our experience, that was kind of like over here. And then we went through and logged in as Postgres user. So again, I'm going to cheat just a little bit, and we'll do something like this. Because we essentially went through and kind of circled back to our initial starting point. And we explored port. I'm not clicking all over the place. We went through and we logged in as SSH, right? Using port 22. Put this over here. Again, it's okay if it's not too clean. Port 22, and we ran through that whole thing of privilege escalation, right? So now we have kind of like, as you can see, modeled out the entire experience, just step at a time, nothing too crazy. We have it kind of represented. And now the really fun part begins. So this is kind of a snapshot of it. It's not very specific. It's not tailored. It's more detailed than a sequence of notes that I had here, where in the previous video, at the end of it, I kind of went through it and gave you a process of it, the attack path, essentially. It's a lot more structured than if I just went through the experience and kind of just said, oh, I'm good, right? That would be almost very little. Now I have specific steps, and we're kind of refining it. Now we need to make sense and organize it somehow and kind of maybe look at it one step at a time. There's a lot of stuff going on here. And this is where frameworks become very, very valuable. And usually you can create your own framework, but in our case, we don't really have to do that. We can go and ask our friends over at MITRE. There are plenty of frameworks out there online for different topics. So the main takeaway is don't invent your own. Just see if there is another one already exists and just piggyback off of it. So MITRE does the same, very similar to what we're doing here. They're a knowledge repository essentially, but they have access to the entire world, a lot more than Max has access to, of course. So, but they have a nice framework for like penetration testing. They have phases: reconnaissance, resource development, initial access, privilege escalation that we've done, right? And on and on. And those categories is the framework. Ultimately, it's a way how they organize information. In our case, that's overwhelming. We don't need that whole monstrosity of a framework. It's very, they have departments of people working on this. This is very in-depth and thorough. But in our case, we might say, well, did we do reconnaissance? Yeah, we did like Nmap. Did we do initial access? Yeah, we did like a reverse shell. That sounds about right. Did we do like privilege escalation? The answer is yeah. So we can start creating our own like framework, and I'll just do it in a README file. And this is where it becomes kind of like a living document, right? And we can start with like, okay, so maybe one area of our experience is reconnaissance. Another one is initial access. And one is priv privilege escalation, right? So now, and I'm kind of like cleaning it up just a little bit so you can kind of see the method to the madness here, because the numbering convention will be very simple. So now we have these three categories, and now we can look back at our experience, this whole entire thing, and start to kind of think through like, okay, how do we group like things together? So for example, and I'll do this so you guys can see it very, very visually. And that's just how I usually think through it too. So this first portion of it here was kind of like one area, right? It was kind of like part of that reconnaissance. We did like a scan. We, saved the password or the IP address, and then we ran nmap. Okay, that's one. Another section might have been over here, like exploring port 21. That was also kind of like reconnaissance until we got some files that we wanted to download, right? So it's kind of like its own cubby hole, right? Let's see, we can do like another one was maybe like cracking a zip file that was over here that was password protected. Right, so now we're kind of like grouping the experience a little bit, right? And then maybe cracking a password or a hash over here because we found some like hash, wasn't a password, but we were able to identify things. So maybe over here. We can do the same thing, kind of like start slicing up the experience into sections a little bit. And we'll do one more just over here for privilege escalation because it's a fun one. So over here, we kind of logged in as the user, and then we said, oh, we can use VI to escape out of it, and we escalated privilege to root, right? So now we're kind of using the framework to help us organize this crazy, diagram. And now we can zoom in on it one at a time. So for example, let's take this section here. I'll kind of highlight a different color so you can see it. So nmap. Okay, what did we really do with nmap? And this is where we'll kind of use nice features. So this is the experience overall, right? Tab. And this will be our 1.1. Let's call it nmap scan task. Little specific task that we did here, right? Because its own thing. This is where it gets really, really simple. We can exit out of this. We don't need all of this. I just want to zoom in on that one specific thing and kind of work through it a little bit more. Okay. So we got this. So what did we really do when we ran the nmap scan? Well, we didn't just run it. Remember, we set our IP variable to that specific thing, right? We go back. We can see here we exported IP address, and then we ran sudo nmap with specific parameters, right? Then we might have ran the actual nmap, and the command for that was second, adjusting my notes a little bit so I don't get too crazy. But the command was this, right? So now we're like really refining that process down. And those of you that are software engineers are like, well, man, you can probably create a script that does that for you. And the answer is you can create a script, right? And then we documented some findings. And then the last thing I like to do is do this. We take it a step further. What was the output of that? Well, the output was a list of open ports, right? And that was port 21, port 80, port 22. And I know I'm kind of like playing around with organizing this nmap, right? And so now we have that very specific task that we've refined down. We kind of zoomed in out of this overall experience. We thought through this a little bit more, reviewed our notes, and we can continue to do that for every single task, right? So for example, let's do another one real quick, just because it's fun. So we duplicate this. That's kind of how I do it, at least. We'll do the privilege escalation one. VI, we'll call it VI escape. I don't know, sounds cool. And if you're wondering why I'm labeling it 1.1 or 3.1 is, remember, we already had our framework, right? If I can find it. So now we have like an nmap scan. We have the one that we're about to do is called vescape. At least that's what I call it for now. And you can see we can kind of like annotate which tasks we have identified, and this ultimately becomes our taxonomy. I also ultimately typically do is like miscellaneous column here. If one of the tasks doesn't really fit into those 3 categories, I just throw everything into miscellaneous. And if I have a lot of miscellaneous item later on, that gives me an idea that maybe I should come back to like the MITRE framework and pick out one of these other categories to kind of make sense out of those if they have like some commonality, and that allows me to add another theme to my framework, right? And that's how I expand the framework. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. But in this one, vescape. So again, we're just going to do a quick like, put this over here. We don't need any of this, right? So we can just delete that, delete this, delete this. We're just cleaning it up. So we're like extracting the specific knowledge out of it. And check my notes real quick. So first we might do something like check privileges, right? And that's what we actually did. Again, we'll kind of clean it up later on, but for now I'm just trying to get through it so this video isn't too long. Can we use sudo? Yep, we can use sudo. And then run shell, we have our command. And then what was the output here? So the output was root access. So again, learn one little thing about this, right? And so now we have this. Again, I can't not do this, kind of. We have this one nice little process that we can come out of this, right? So now all I really do is just like open up another instance of draw.io real quick. We get rid of the grid lines, right? We're gonna name this one, let's say, it's gonna be a little bit of like copy paste effectively. But you'll see the method to the madness here shortly, hopefully. And then when we go to save it, now we're not saving it as an experience. We're going to save it just in our overall folder, and we're going to extract it as its own subtask, right? We can do the same thing for the other one as well. So for example, we identified nmap scan. We take this, we're going to copy it real quick. To our nmap scan task. And then we're going to kind of just break it out, and we're going to save it as nmap scan, right? So now when we go back to our knowledge base, you can see we're starting to fill it out, right? We're starting to pull out those individual little knowledge nuggets, they're called knowledge artifacts, and we start populating. And we can do that for every single section out of this one, this one, this one. We can think about how to organize it, break it apart. You know, we can have the same thing going on over here as well, et cetera, right? And I'm not going to go through like modeling out every single one. I'll kind of show you a complete product. But why is that important? Well, now we have very specific tasks that are almost like Lego pieces that we're pulling out of this experience. And we can also start compressing things. So for example, if this is its own task that we have in a repo, essentially what happens is we can start representing our attack path more like coherently. For example, like this goes away, and then this whole thing goes away. And so now we have like that one nice subtask that's nice and crisp and clean. And, we can do the same thing for all of them until it's a nice structured like attack path with very well defined tasks and commands. And within that, we know that there are knowledge gaps as well. And that's okay. Your knowledge manager can like review that and see it later on. And that can kind of drive training, right? And then I'll show you guys one last thing real quick. So every time we create one of those, we're learning something. We have learned that task, right? To whatever level of completeness. Wouldn't it be cool to like track that? Like, how do you track your learning? Well, here's a quick example of it. So we can create like a quick Excel spreadsheet. Insert a table. Maybe we'll do like date. Let me kind of cheat a little bit for expediency here. We'll put like a source. We'll put description of the experience. Let's see. You can add as many columns as you like. I'm just going to do this one as an example. And then the last thing I like to track is like, what did we actually change in our knowledge base, right? So we now have a nice tracker, a record, if you will. And we're going to make it blue. So now maybe, what's today? 11/09/2025. Source was HTB vaccine. Description of experience. Maybe I worked through like just a quick summary of the events, right? I worked through that. And then description of what was learned. Well, I learned how to run Nmap, really. Running Nmap. And then what was the output of that learning? Like, so what, right? Okay, cool. And we updated, not recon Nmap, but Nmap scan, our little task, right? Now we also did the other one. So all of this is really like about the same. The only thing that will change is maybe, let's see, this vescape one. So we're just kind of documenting it real quick. And then we learn to escalate out of VI shell. Okay, so specifically, what did I learn or what did I modify, right? And now I have a tracker, so I can do that, model out tasks, continue to add them here. And over a period of time, you can imagine if I have 100 tasks, I can look at things, okay, how many things am I learning per week? What is the source of my learning that's the best? Where am I getting the most learning? If I have a framework, like we have this one here, where I have recon, initial access, priv, I can start looking and saying, okay, what am I really strong at? Where am I weak at? Where is most of my learning coming from? Am I learning a lot of recon techniques? Am I learning a lot of privilege escalation techniques? And that allows me to be more aware of my learning pattern relating to this knowledge domain, which is like penetration testing, although it could be applied to any sort of learning. And I can become more efficient at learning. So it's almost like meta learning. I'm learning how I'm learning. How do I learn best the specific task, right? And that's pretty much it. All I wanted to show for now, as you will see, and I'll show you like a completed example of this. So I went through and modeled out that experience, same thing, prepping for this video, but I actually went through and pulled out every single thing out of it. And just one experience, I've learned all of these things in there. You know, there's a learning tracker that tracks what I've learned specifically just from one experience. And here's a nice perk behind all of this, like the so what, like, okay, why even go through a knowledge base and go through all of this like hassle? And there's a couple of very specific reasons. So number one, it allows you to learn your knowledge area. Obviously, in this case, I'm becoming familiar with penetration testing. Okay. Allows you to learn very, very efficiently. As you can see, the learning tracker allows me to do like an analytics on my learning rate, learning preferences, etc. So I can be faster at learning. I can accelerate my learning. Allows you to share knowledge easily. So once you have this knowledge in a repo, and as long as people understand the modeling standard, it's very easy for everybody else to kind of go through and capitalize on what you have learned and share knowledge that way. We typically share knowledge as humans just by communication, but that's not typically very efficient or feasible because we have to put two people in the same room at the same time, and hopefully they generally speak, effectively to transmit ideas. If you have one repo, anybody can review it at any point in time, right? And then makes you more efficient at your job. So like, here's an example of that. So we looked at Nmap scan, and here's two steps, and I kind of alluded to it earlier. I said, well, can I write a script? Because I had to physically go in and type out this command and then this command, and we can see it in my notes here where I typed out this and then I typed out that. Can I just write a script where I just give it an IP address and it just runs everything else? The answer is yes. Can you write a script for everything in that knowledge base? So all of these tasks, can you start like finding ways to automate all of those? The answer is yes. And then here's kind of like the denouement, the last thing that's really is really good about KBs in any sense is they allow more advanced capabilities. So for example, here I'm just simply doing some hack the box, but now somebody might have an idea. Well, Max, you took this like experience and you saw how I like shrunk everything here. And so I've documented it in hindsight. But when I have a lot of those Lego pieces, can I figure out a way to assemble them to hypothesize a potential attack given a certain goal? And the answer is yes. That would be like an attack path analysis. But in order to do that, we have to have those Lego pieces pre-built. And so then we can do a very simple assessment of like the target environment, not even the machine, but like the environment. And we can hypothesize multiple potential attack paths and then go and execute them. Cool thing about that is we either A, hit our goal, which is great. We found like a vulnerability, or B, we did not hit our goal because there was a control mechanism in like that environment that prevented us from executing our attack path, but we will have a very specific visual of it where we know exactly where in our attack path that control mechanism prevented us from like executing the attack, and we have learned something about the environment in terms of what kind of controls they have, right? And that again can allow us to become more and more efficient at conducting like penetration tests or just attacking environments in the future. But all of those advanced capabilities, they kind of start with some of this basic stuff of having a good knowledge base, having experiences, documenting them, creating them, and then it kind of evolves into other more advanced topics, even that kind of goes even past like the attack path analysis that I just kind of briefly described, right? So I'll stop there. That kind of concludes a lot of the main points of creating like a knowledge base, capturing the experience and then reflecting on the experience, creating diagrams. It does take time, but you can see how much more learning happens when you actually reflect on the experience instead of just accruing experience. Hopefully you enjoyed this video series. Hopefully you'll find some other fun ways to apply in the future. And for next couple of videos, I'll probably just hit up some more machines on Hack the Box and maybe do like a quick, hey, here's what I've learned and here's a couple of process diagrams I've created. But this is kind of like the meat and potatoes of the video series, these first 3 videos. Thanks for watching and see you soon.